Mixing with Mike Bootcamp tip. A great mix requires thousands of small decisions. One of the biggest challenges for making a great mix is that we all want instant gratification. We want things to sound great immediately. And so the tendency is to try to push things into a place and force them to be in a way that sounds finished. And the problem with that is that a mix is about the relationship of many tracks and instruments as they're put together within the arrangement. So for me, the process of mixing is more about doing it in layers because I found this is the easiest way to maintain stability in the mix so you don't overprocess one thing and then spend a lot of time trying to catch up with other sounds only to find your mix to be a big mess. When I say processing in layers, the basic idea is more a Zen like approach where you really take a look at the relationship of every element in the mix, what its role and function is in the mix, and then put it in the best place to succeed. So for me, starting a mix really starts with gain structure. So I'll start by putting together and making sure that no signal, right? No signal, no drum or percussion or instrument or whatever peaks above -6. Or if it's a more of an RMS driven instrument like a bass, that the average level never goes above -18. And the basic idea of setting up that gain structure is I have a consistent flow of the song. I have plenty of headroom to work with on the individual tracks, and I minimize the potential for my mix bus overloading. As I go through each step in the process, the next step is to do levels and panning. And before I even begin to do a single bit of processing, I want to know what every element of the mix is doing. I want to put it in proper balance and put it in its proper perspective. So when I put together a mix, I think about, all right, I'll take all the drums and percussion. Maybe this is the primary groove, and how it blends with the bass really drives the song. So I want to make sure that my rough mix, as close as possible, right, without EQ, compression, or anything, reflects the basic placement that I and balances that I want to have in the mix. And I won't pick up a single EQ or compressor or any form of processing until I have a good sense of where everything is and how I want to process it. At times, even if I have very complicated mix, I'll use the notes down at the bottom to just make notes to myself about where I want to place a particular instrument. In most cases, it's pretty obvious. Most of the time, you want to have the vocal right out front, so I'm going to process it accordingly. When I start out with the basic mix, I'm going to mix it a little bit louder so it pulls out a little bit front. It doesn't mean that everything sounds finished, but when I listen to the mix, I want to hear the basic flow of the mix beginning to end. I want to get a feel for the whole arrangement. I want it to maybe narrow in the verses. And so when the chorus parts come in, maybe I pan them a little bit wider. And I pay attention to all these small details, the relationship of things. If I have multiple things in the same pan position, how do I set the balances between them? Maybe one is going to be a little bit brighter than the other. So I want to enhance that when I get to the equalization stage. But I want to know exactly what I want to do. I never want to be guessing in a mix. You never want to go through any part of the mix where you're doing guesswork, where you pick up a track and it's like, I don't know, maybe this sounds good. Or you spend all your time in solo. One of the biggest problems that people have with mixing is that they'll have a tendency to obsess about things. So if they hear like a harshness in the vocal, they won't start anything until they fix that harshness in the vocal. And it's a very bad strategy. The way that I work in a mix is that, let's say, for example, I have harshness in the vocal. So I start out and I do a basic EQ and I try a little bit, and maybe the EQ does nothing really to help with the harshness. So what I do is a more general EQ to maybe add a little bit of warmth, balance the low frequency, high frequency response, and then move on to the compression. So rather than trying to fix it, I'll spend a smaller amount of time on it and continue to move on the mix. So I don't obsess about it. I accept the fact that the sound is not perfect, and the first layer of equalization which goes across helps to create separation between the instruments. I heighten one element by adding a little bit of brightness to it and maybe making one have a little darker tonal center so they can sit in the same pan position and basically work together. And I very carefully and meticulously kind of work, but fairly quickly, right? I don't obsess about anything at any given stage. The next layer might be compression. So if I put a layer of compression, this is really about staging, right? Things that need to breathe more and move more because maybe they propel the groove. I'm thinking about the compression settings in such a way that all the drums feel like they're breathing together. So maybe they all have the same attack and release time so that I feel all of the drums and percussion sort of breathing or moving together, right? Nothing too excessive though. And the pads and those things that are more sustaining, maybe I work with things like shorter attack or a fast attack and a very long release. So it sort of holds the sounds and doesn't create a lot of movement, sort of condenses them a little bit and I can mix them back, right? So they sit behind the mix. And I very carefully go through. So as I do each layer with the EQ and then the compression, I'm not skipping over to the next four steps of what I want to do with the vocal. So even though the vocal is still harsh, I will do what I can with the EQ and the compression, but never overdo it and never spend too much time on it. The problem with spending too much time on anything in a mix is that as you go through the sound and you you continue to hack away, you get frustrated. The things you're doing maybe aren't working or aren't as effective as you like them to be. And what happens, the biggest problem is that you lose perspective on the mix. So now that you have this obsession and you're listening to the rest of the mix, you are ignoring the rest of the instrumentation because you can't stop thinking about this one aspect of one sound that's really bugging you. And it's important to let that go and be patient. Live with the harshness a little bit and slowly chip away at it, slowly chip away at it. So you could do that on the vocal, partly with the EQ, partly with this, and then maybe you select a warming compressor, something that adds a little bit of warmth to help balance out. So maybe the harshness cuts a little bit less. And then maybe when you add some kind of effect, like when you get to the next stage, and you start to add in effects like early reflections and reverb, you select warmer reverbs. Maybe you apply a de-esser before the reverb so that that harshness doesn't cut through and exaggerate the effect. So now the warming effect of maybe a short room reverb that you feel maybe helps to add some body to fill out the vocals so the harshness then becomes a little bit less harsh. And chip away at it, but always maintain perspective on the rest of the mix. It's important that you have a strategy, that you really know exactly what you want to do, or to the best degree that you can, what you want to do with any given instrument. The more you guess, the bigger you're going to, the more problems you're going to have. Because what will happen is you'll say, hey, I got a piano sound, and you solo it up and you say, okay, I got a great piano sound. And then you unsolo it, maybe you change the level a little bit to mix it in, and then you just kind of move on. When I listen to a piano, most of the time I'll start EQing it inside of the track. What frequencies can I boost? Where does it fit into the track? What frequencies really bring it out in the mix? And then I'll solo it up, and then I'll start to work and shape that a little bit within the sound in solo, take it out of solo, and really notice how it affects everything else in the mix. What happens with this EQ if I take it out? What happens with the bass? What happens with the kick drum? What happens with the guitar tracks? How does it affect the vocal? And this way, if I check on all of these relationships and I'm careful to maintain unity gain, so if I apply EQ, I apply compression, I apply any form of processing, I want to make sure when I A/B it in and out that the level is as close as it can possibly be to what it was without the processing. Keep it more or less even. And that way I maintain a perspective in the track. So when you EQ, obviously you're shaping, you're adding certain frequencies, taking away other frequencies. So when you balance the gain, you try to balance the same basic leveling position in the mix, like its same position in the mix. How far out front does this vocal stand? When you take the EQ and out, should be basically the same, except a little bit clearer and more focused. Ideally, if you're doing the work well, your sounds will become progressively more focused as you do each layer. It requires a lot of patience and it requires a lot of discipline to work this way. But if you work this way in layers, what will happen is your mixes, although they won't sound great right away, you won't get the sort of instantaneous results. What'll happen is that all those tiny little decisions of paying attention to the way each of the instruments affect each other throughout the course of each step of processing with the EQ, with the compression, with the effects processing, maybe some vintage processing, running parallel chains for distortion, things like that. If you maintain your perspective and do it in layers, you kind of bring the whole mix up one level at a time, right? So that each stage of the mix still maintains the basic approach that you want, but now it's a little bit clearer, a little bit more focused. The depth field starts to open up. And then you start to make decisions with effects. How do you want your effects? You want like a big reverb on the vocal? Well, almost it's necessary if you're going to do that to set up things in such a way where nothing else has as big of a reverb, right? So if you want some big, open, delay-filled reverb for the vocal, everything else almost necessarily has to be drier. Otherwise, what you end up doing is over-processing. So a lot of the decisions when you work this way, if you do all the effects at once, it will keep you from putting like a huge, sound, big reverb sound on the drums, and then if you then try to put a big reverb sound on the vocal, what often will end up happening is that you'll have to exaggerate the reverb on the vocal to overtake all of the huge reverb on the drums, and then you end up in this war where you keep adding more of everything, and then all of a sudden you lose perspective on the rest of the mix. It's important to really understand what it is that you want to highlight, what it is that you want to feature, and process accordingly. So if it's the vocal, when you get to that particular layer in the mix, and let's say it's effect or reverb, set up that vocal reverb first, then, get it kind of balanced out the way that you want, and then start to add reverb to other instruments. And what you can do then is you can check as you set reverb on the drums to make sure that that reverb doesn't create problems with the vocal, that it doesn't create problems or minimize the effect with the guitars. And this keeps you from over processing. And this is where things start to go off the rails and start to sound unnatural, because you have to exaggerate things and you end up in this situation, very famous quote, everything louder than everything else, where everything is fighting for attention. And then you end up with this big messy mix where everything is fighting each other. So pay attention to the details. Pay attention to things as a whole. Always maintain that perspective of everything as a whole. Never obsess about individual sounds if you have problems with them. Chip away at it. Work a little bit more slowly. Maintain the perspective of the whole of the mix. If you can maintain this discipline and kind of work in a layered approach like this, and you maintain some consistency with that approach, you'll find that the results are way more dramatically positive. And it's really just a simple thing of maintaining the relationship of one instrument to the next, right? How they complement each other. I'll do so many things like this, just with effects, for example. It's almost always the case in every mix, and if you really listen to every commercial mix, you'll almost always find at least one element that is dry or very close to dry. Not always, but most mixes you will find something that has a very dry component to it. And what that does is it acts like a contrast point that allows those big reverb effects to not have to be as loud. Just that one thing. It's in EDM music all the time. You have that dry kick drum, just sits there, tick, 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 right in the middle, and it allows you to do all this swirling stuff and spatial effects and big reverbs and all kinds of delays and sweeping filters, because that one dry element creates a reference point from which everything else can kind of bounce off of. And almost every mix has some kind of reference point like that. Sometimes it's the vocal, sometimes it's the kick drum, sometimes it's the bass, sometimes it's a keyboard, right? One main part, right, that just plays through the whole song. That acts as the reference point. And you have to sort of think about it from that perspective. And if you really listen to commercial mixes, you'll always, always, always find something, one consistent element that goes almost always from beginning to end, whatever it is, an acoustic guitar, a piano, kick drum, whatever. That becomes the kind of what I call like, like the clothesline from which everything hangs. It's really breaks down to simple things. And if you pay attention to the small details and as you make adjustments to the frequency response of any particular instrument, the easiest way to do it is mix and do the EQ or do the processing in the context of the whole mix and pay attention to the other elements of the mix and how it might be stepping on things and really keep that in balance. If you do that, your mixing will improve dramatically. You'll find that you do much less processing along the way to get great results. And you'll find that you'll mix far more efficiently as well, maintaining that overall perspective. So hack away at it, maintain some patience, and do the best you can to kind of do things in layers because it's really a lot of small decisions and a lot of cat-like attention, really paying attention to all of the details and the way things affect each other. Over time, those small decisions add up to a great mix. Don't try to get away with doing it all at once. This is a boot camp tip. It's one of the things I teach in the boot camp course, a 52-week course that will go through hundreds of different types of techniques like this. And the whole system of this layered approach to mixing is covered in detail with 4 full mixes that are completed and many other mixes with demonstrations along the way to show the different techniques. So you'll see all these things happen with different styles of music to show that the same basic formula will work regardless of the style that you're working on. And then the processing decisions will change a bit, and those techniques are discussed as well. Check it out at mixingwithmike.com. This is a boot camp tip. Great mix requires 1,000 small decisions. Don't forget it.